This is what I call the conditions of freedom. We're very far from this today, but I think this is a good goal. This at least gives us a clear picture of what a free regime, a free society looks like. It gives us a clear picture of the qualities of citizenship required for freedom. Thank you, everyone, very much.
Q&A, who's got a question for Tom? Okay, Dave, right here.
You alluded to it a little bit when you talked about the women about slavery. How did the founders basically rationalize equal individual human rights with the existence of slavery? And there's only one reason I know, and that was to form the government, that they agreed to do that. But
well, I mean, when you say rational, so I'm going to summarize a detailed, complex story. I think the story of how the Americans dealt with and solved the problem of slavery is one of the most noble, beautiful stories in the history of the world. It's amazingly beautiful. It's beautiful for this reason. I don't think you would. I think that's too hot. Let's do this. Yeah, somehow. Let's see here. Yeah, that'll melt if you stick that on. It's really hot. There's a lot to say about this, but let me just point out one really obvious fact, which we all know. Slavery is as old as human nature. It's this horrific practice that has been around for thousands of years. There is no group of people in all of recorded history who acted as swiftly, as courageously, as justly as the Americans did. They formed a new nation, and in 2 generations, or if you want to use Lincoln's dating at Gettysburg, within 77 years, they abolished slavery by way of a constitutional amendment. In 2 generations, this institution that had been around for thousands of years, and they did it. I mean, you can argue, well, they did it for many different reasons, but this much is clear. As those Americans reflected on the idea of human equality, growing numbers of them came to the conclusion that slavery is wrong. It's wrong. They talked about it. They wrote about it. This was sort of a new revelation in the history of human thought, that people were actually talking publicly about slavery being wrong. That hadn't happened. There were a few minds who produced a few dusty old philosophic treatises who had made the argument that slavery was wrong. It had never become a public movement. In the United States, it became a public movement. Open, public, widespread discussion about how, wow, we know that this institution is part of our history. To talk like a modern academic today, it's part of our culture. It's part of our cultural background. But rather than say we need to celebrate our cultural background, they said, let's look at our culture and identify with moral clarities the moral clarity, the bad parts of it. And slavery is the worst. And let's work to get rid of it. So in that sense, I wouldn't argue that they rationalized. I don't know. I've been studying the history of slavery in the United States for 25 years. And in those 25 years, I have never encountered a piece of evidence, a piece of literature, that anyone from the founding generation offered a moral justification of slavery. What some did is some offered a kind of red-faced, embarrassed, economic interest. Hey, many of the people we represent have plantations and slaves, and they're not going to vote to just get rid of slavery instantly. And that was true. I mean, that was reality. They weren't going to vote for that. And the problem was you needed the consent of the governed. But nothing like that had happened in the entire history of the world. And I also remind people on this subject of slavery, Americans today are really tempted, deeply tempted, and they often give in to this temptation, to view slavery as some ancient, anachronistic thing from the past. It is not. It exists today. It's not gone from the world. It's not part of this ancient, history that's unimaginable to us. We can go get on an airplane at DIA and within 36 hours we can be in North Africa. And if you have enough cash in your pocket, you can buy a human being in the light of day. You don't have to hide the transaction in some cellar or some basement. You can stand on a street corner and buy a human being today. So if slavery has not been eradicated in 2018, I find it mind-boggling that nim-witted, tiny-souled little academics stand on stages and wag their fingers and scold and shame the founding generation. Why didn't they do more? Really? Really? They did more than anyone had ever done in the history of the world. They weren't perfect. They weren't angels, but they were better than any other group of human beings. And I say, good for them. Congratulations. I'm glad that they did that. Does that answer your question? We're gonna. Yes, sir. Okay. Oh. Okay.
It's actually one of those little tiny soul people wagging their fingers visited our lunch and said that in 1772 Britain had abolished slavery, and 1775, whatever it was, and that was the reason that everybody that was wanting to rebel against Britain were all the slave owners, and that it was driven to preserve slavery in the United States. You don't need to go on for 20 minutes, but tell me what you should say to a guy like that.
Well, a couple things. First is make sure you have your facts right. So the United Kingdom did not abolish slavery until the 1840s. France did it in the 1830s. What the United Kingdom did prior to the Declaration of Independence is they criminalized the slave trade. But they had not, it was still, you could still legally own a slave. But the bigger point that I want to make, what's that? Throughout the United Kingdom, all the colonies, for example, in the, I understand, but for example, Virginia was part of England, yes? And slavery was legal in Virginia, that English colony, in 1775. It was not, the Parliament had not outlawed slavery throughout the British Empire. Here's the bigger point, though. The bigger point is, how long had England been around? You see the difference? How many centuries did it take English people to come to the conclusion that maybe slavery is wrong? I had a little debate with sort of a student of David Barton who was making the argument of the Christian influence of the founding and abolitionism. And so I raised this question. I said, I'm just curious, how many centuries of Christians did precisely 0 over the problem of slavery? Centuries. 2 millennia went by, and it wasn't a big enough problem to actually do anything about it. You can cut up humanity anyway, by religion, by nationality, by government types. Here's the bottom line. Groups of people went thousands of years not thinking that slavery was wrong, that it was just traditional. It's just the way it happens. I mentioned Dinesh D'Souza before. In my opinion, his single best work, still, he's written many books, but his single best book is his early book titled The End of Racism. It's fantastic. It's a very long, dense academic treatise on sort of the history of race, which is a relatively modern, it comes out of modern European philosophy in the 1900s. And he chronicles in there this story of, this is in the 1700s, there are some Christian missionaries in Africa, and they write in their diary, they're sitting there smoking some kind of juju weed with the tribal chief and whoever else, right? And the subject of slavery comes up. And these Europeans, I don't remember if they were French Catholics or if they were English, I don't remember who they were. But these Europeans are trying to persuade this tribal chief, African chief, that slavery's wrong. And this chief gives them this kind of confused look. What do you mean wrong? That's like saying gravity is wrong. I mean, slavery just is. It's just the way of the world. The only question is, are you going to be the master or are you going to be the slave? It really sucks to be the slave. It's much better to be the master. That's the only choice that we have. This notion that's wrong and just isn't going to exist, this is crazy talk. This makes no sense. What that tribal chief was expressing is the way most human beings thought for 10,000 years. That's just the way that it is. Even when you read the most dramatic anti-slavery story in all of history, which is in the Old Testament, the story of Moses freeing the Jews out of Egypt, they don't abolish slavery. The Jewish position in the book of Exodus is not that slavery as an institution is wrong. Their position is it's wrong for us to be enslaved. They were quite willing to enslave others. And there was no effort to eradicate slavery from Egypt or anywhere else. Do you see how radical this idea is that all men are created equal, ergo, no human being has any rightful claim to the person and property of another human being. Period. That slavery is always and everywhere wrong. Not just wrong when it happens to me, not just wrong when it happens to my friends or my kin, right, or my tribal people. It's always and everywhere wrong. And the Americans came to understand that. And they wrote beautifully about it, and they spoke beautifully about it. And it's one of the peaks, it's one of the moral peaks in all of human history, that moral clarity as to why human bondage is wrong.
We're going to go to the really
Okay.
handsome man in the Sturgis shirt over there. Dad.
Dad.
So, wonderful chart. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I've never seen it laid out so clearly and simply.
Thank you very much.
As Plato would say, he who understands a question the best answers it most simply.
Thank you.
So, around the right and top borders, you see the top-down forming of a government. Top-down only because it was a select few that got to model it. The two yellow boxes you see are the bottoms up of allowing or asking for some help from a government.
Okay.
Discuss why morals don't appear in the most left-hand box under citizenship.
Well,
Because as you pointed out, self-governed people need to be moral to get along, to go down the same road, or you have slavery,
yeah.
right?
Yes.
So morals has to play a big. Where do morals come into this?
So, excellent question. Let me make very clear, when the founders were writing about this subject, they used various terms frequently. Morals, the law of morals, moral virtue, right? And sometimes they would actually identify various moral virtues. So what I'm doing here is distilling and summarizing. That category of self-government is my way of summarizing the moral virtues that the founder said were absolutely necessary. If you want an example of this, read the preamble to the Massachusetts State Constitution, which is the only constitution which is older than the United States Constitution. Massachusetts was written in 1780, so 7 years prior, and numerous states used it as a kind of model. And in the Massachusetts Constitution, in the preamble, they actually go through and list fortitude and wisdom, and they list the moral virtues that they say, this is what's necessary for a free people. Another place I highly recommend that you go check out is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is a beautiful document. It's short. I always would have students read the Northwest Ordinance simply because it's a model of, if we're going to have legislators passing laws, then they ought to pass laws like the Northwest Ordinance. It's short. You can read it. You can actually understand what the point of it is. And there's a section in the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, if this was a map of the United States, right, and here's the East Coast over here, and here's the West Coast over here, we think of that whole thing as the United States. At the time of the founding, the United States was a group of people smashed along the eastern seaboard. So from their perspective, if you went north and west, this big area here, what would later become Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, right? That whole part of the country was the Northwest Territory. And Congress, the first Congress, which included people like James Madison. Folks forget that Madison ran for and was elected to the very first Congress as a representative from Virginia, and he helped to author the Northwest Ordinance. And there's this section in the Northwest Ordinance that deals with education. And what it says, it doesn't call for public education. It offers a recommendation for the content of education. And get this. This is public law, statutory law passed by Congress. You know what Congress said in 1787 should be the core of education? Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary for a free people. Right? So there's the way that they described it. When I put self-restraint, that's me just coming up with a little catchy phrase that people might remember. That includes moral self-restraint. Absolutely. Don.
Yeah, on that. And to me, those first two boxes are the moral statement in history that every individual human being is an end in themselves. They're not the property of someone else. That they are their own standard of life, but their life and their right to their life is the standard of value. I mean, all morality and ethics comes from that.
No, I fully agree. I was trying to address the fact that we as individuals need to have a moral compass.
Agreed.
Or we won't practice those things in unison.
Yes.
That was my thought.
Yeah. Agreed. And to the degree I can speak for the founders, I'll put it this way. My reading of the founders suggests to me that they agree with what you just said.
That's the top-down morals. Here's what we think we should model, but we as citizens have the responsibility to say we agree.
Absolutely. And in fact, just to make this, drive this point home and make it relevant to today, I think one of our great challenges, when I say our, I mean we freedom lovers, we few. You do know this, right? We're very few. In fact, we're weird. You get this, right? You're here in this room in the middle of the week. What is tonight? You're on a Monday night, right? And so you're very weird. I'm weird too. But one of the challenges is not just to say, but to teach and inspire and attract fellow citizens with a message that our problems will go away if they stop asking the government for so much. Stop asking. Provide for yourselves. Do what you want to do. Stop asking for things. One of the things, I've done very little coaching with actual elected politicians because I find once they get into office, they're for the most part worthless. Few exceptions, Don Beasley being one of them. But they do often tend to go astray. And, one of the things I offer just as an idea is when you're going around, running, campaigning, actively tell people, say, please support me, right? Please go hand out flyers for me and give money to my campaign. Do all the things that I need. And the moment I get elected, don't ask a thing from me. Don't. Stop. Because our problems grow when people are, oh, my friend just got elected. Now I'm going to go hit him up for a subsidy for my business, for, a waiver from this regulation, whatever it is. Stop asking for things from government. And if we had citizens who lived this way, this kind of citizen, here's another way this is a distillation. Here's a way to distill it even more to one basic point. This kind of citizen is not needy. They're not needy. This is a kind of citizen who is a fully functioning, responsible, courageous, mature adult making his or her own choices in life and taking the consequences, whether those consequences are good or bad, not blaming someone else and not expecting anything for free. That's the model of citizenship. Yes? Right here, we got a question.
In all these discussions, to contrast this model with this model, which is based on a misguided sense of altruism and collective responsibility, just so that people have a better understanding when we're debating political issues. Because if you don't understand the other side, we'll call them the enemy. For purposes of this conversation, they will woo you because they know how to appeal to people's hearts. And we're thinkers. We reason our way to results. They think with their hearts. And until we understand their model, everyone can articulate clearly what the wellsprings of their thinking is, we lose.
I agree. I agree with everything you just said. And part of what I've been trying to do for 20 years, I continue to work on this and experiment with messaging and communication and styles and appeals. The truth is, this big realm of privacy, where people are living their lives the way they want to, running their businesses the way they want to, raising their families the way that they want to, that is the source of beautiful things. That's the environment in which people invent new medicines that cure sicknesses. That's the environment in which people figure out how to build sturdier homes and buildings. Right? This is the environment that lifespans grow longer and people suffer fewer terrible diseases. That comes from this. The collectivist model undoes all these good things. The collectivist model comes in and says, okay, we just take for granted the medicines and the homes and the cars and all these things. We're just going to assume that all that's going to exist, and we're going to socialize everything. And when they go to socialize everything, they're actually undermining the very conditions that created all those good things. So it is a mistake. You're right when you say we tend not to appeal to the heart. And we make a mistake when we do that. We ought to be appealing to the heart. Let me just throw out one simple set of facts. The last 75 years in the United States have been 75 years of New Dealism, 75 years of socialism. And you know what we've seen in the last 75 years? Historically unprecedented increasing rates of child abuse. In fact, I'll put out something. Is there any doubt in anyone's mind that right now in the United States, after 75 years of collectivism and New Dealism and socialism, does anyone doubt that we have more children in the United States who want to go into schools and murder other children? True or false? That's true. Why do we have so many children who want to go murder other children? It's part of 75 years of disastrous, socialized, collectivized, New Deal policies. Why do we have increasing rates of spousal abuse, of domestic abuse, of substance abuse, of neglect? Hang around a social worker for a while. See what they see. They see really ugly stuff.
Why is it
They see
video games or something, Tom?
What's that?
Why isn't it video games?
Well,
Any of those other things they point to?
it might be. I mean, those things are probably pieces of it, right? You have technology has changed things as well. But these phenomena are decades old. They predate video games. I mean, if you've not read, there's a little document, you can Google it and instantly find it. Senator Moynihan, in 1965, just get your brain around that date, 1965, wrote an essay. He wrote it out of terror and despair at what was happening to the black family, to families of blacks in the United States. At that time, the rates of black children born into homes where the parents were not around was something like 30 or 40%, and he thought it was a national emergency then. There are parts of cities in the United States that have rates of near 100% of black children being born into families where their mom and dad aren't almost 100%. And, I mentioned hang out with social workers for a while because you'll actually see the real human harm that is caused. And this is one of these things, I actually get really frustrated by my fellow freedom folks and conservative folks and libertarian folks that they allow anybody on the side of collectivism take the moral high ground because they deserve none of it. They're hurting people. And they're hurting kids. And they're hurting women. And they're destroying lives. And they're breaking families apart. That's what you get from collectivism. In many countries, it is. In fact, I just spent time, some of you probably know my friend Jill Vecchio. She's a radiologist, and she does a lot of work on Obamacare and these things, and she was in Japan. And Japan has one of the most sophisticated, developed systems of socialized medicine in the world. The Minister of Health, right there. If you run a government, you have a Minister of Health, you have a problem. I don't even need to know what the Minister of Health does. You have a problem if you have a Minister. Well, she met with the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Health can't believe that in the United States we still have hospitals where there's one person in a room. They're baffled by this. Over there, they average between 5 to 8 people in the same size room. They put them in there like sardines. The physician and nurses squeeze in between patients. In what's called a direct primary care organization here in the United States, a physician will, in general, see somewhere around 5, 6, 7, 8 patients a day. I'm enrolled in one of those. I go see my physician every time. I don't tend to be sick very often, but when I do go see my physician, she sits down with me for half an hour and talks. In Japan, they see patients, they see an average between 100 to 150 patients per day. Do the math. That means they're spending 2 or 3 minutes. Guess which nation has one of the highest rates of opioid addictions in the world? Japan. You know why? Because the physician doesn't have time to actually figure out what's wrong with you and help you to heal, so they write out a prescription to mask the pain and move on to the next patient. And so they have millions of people running around strung out on, prescription drugs, or then they turn to street drugs to make up for it, whatever it is. The point is, people are getting hurt. They're getting hurt. And so there's no reason for anyone who's interested in freedom to give a platform of moral high ground to any kind of collectivist. Our opening position should always be shame on you. I'm a little embarrassed to be on a stage with you because you hurt people. But if I have to, I guess I will. That should be where we put them all the time. Shame, shame on you. You're hurting people. And nobody talks about that. Our freedom friends are the ones always ducking down, scared to death. They'll be called a racist or be compared to Hitler or some ridiculous thing like that. Rather than saying shame, let's bring back that term shame. People don't talk about it. And yet it's real. There are things that human beings should be ashamed of. There are things every one of us has done that we're embarrassed by, and we know what shame is. They should be feeling shame. And that should be the opening statement. Shame, shame on you.
Do you want to take one more question? Or do you want to start signing books?
This is your show. You tell me.
Do you want to do 3 quick questions?
Let's do 3. I'll try to make it really short, the answers. Yeah.
Don, you can't go.
The Constitution Equal Protection, when you look at like illegal immigration, illegal immigrants, do they really have the same constitutional protections as a U.S. citizen, and should they?
Boy, that's a big question. Should they? No. I'll answer the hypothetical. Should they? No. Although I will say this, right? Our Constitution, even though it has a reputation as being this racist, sexist, misogynistic, immoral, shameful document on university campuses, the truth is, It was written in an incredibly humane way. The language itself is humane. Think of, for an example, think of the Fifth Amendment. No person shall. And then lists all these bad things that government will not do to persons. It doesn't just say citizens. It says persons. So even if you're here in the United States and you're not a citizen, that doesn't mean the government gets to treat you like beef and cut you up and barbecue you. You're still a person, and there are still certain safeguards against your life, for your life and for your person and for your property. So in that sense, the Constitution is a very humane document. But no, look, the bottom line is this. A nationhood is like a private group. It's a private club. And members of a private club decide what their club is going to do, how it's going to be. You have to be a member of the club to decide when the meetings are and what the agenda is going to be. So nationhood means you have to be a citizen to decide who's going to be in the government, right? To vote for these things, to participate in the civil governance of a nation. Someone who sneaks into the country and breaks the law, whatever they are, they're not part of the sovereign body of citizens. One of the strongest arguments that proponents will make for people who are here illegally, entering the United States illegally, to have citizenship, full-blown citizenship. One of their strongest arguments is they'll say, well, they are consenting, right? When they come here, they are giving their consent. They want to be part of the American population. And my response is, that's only half of the equation. The other half is, the American people need to offer them citizenship. Extend that offer. And then if the other person wants to accept it and say, yes, I accept it, I want to be an American citizen, now you have a mutual voluntary agreement. But when it's just one way, right, you don't get to do that. It's a breach of the very idea of a private club. Who else had a question? Corey, you have something?
Yeah, I just was curious to get your thoughts on, as always, you did a great job of laying out the
Thank you.
founder's intent and everything like that. I think the Constitution was written, I think it laid out a government that was, as close to perfect as you can get on this planet to protecting individual rights and property rights and designing a government that's intention was to do that. But obviously it's failed at accomplishing that. And it's, I guess the more time I spend pondering this kind of stuff, the closer I get to believing that if government exists, it will, and even in our history, almost immediately, I'm pretty sure the first Congress started to encroach upon our liberty and property. So if government exists, I think we're better off. I think we would, as humans, be better off if government were a concept that we didn't even have a word for it.
Right.
So what about anarchy?
Well, and clearly that's where your question is. So let me say this. Some of you in this room might be serious anarchists, and some of you might not, and some of you might not be sure and have never really thought about it. I'm not going to give you the final word. That's up to you to figure out. I'm just going to suggest something for you to think about. My PhD is in political science, academic political science. Within my discipline, there is a sub-discipline called democide. Democide. Democide is the study of governments slaughtering their own people. So this does not count a government slaughtering the people of a foreign nation during war. This is governments slaughtering their own people. And it's a hard thing because many governments don't keep real nice, tidy records when they're slaughtering thousands or millions of people. So it takes some work to figure out, just how many, was it 1.6 million the Khmer Rouge slaughtered, or was it 1.8 million? They're trying to piece bones together to figure out how many people were there. And in the last century alone, this is just the last century, government has murdered between 250 million people, those are its own people, between 250 and 300 million in the last century. When people talk about, a little kid gets their hand on a gun and there's a terrible accident, right? And he shoots himself or another little kid. And everyone says, this is terrible. We have to stop this. Or a kid falls into a swimming pool and drowns. Or bad things happen, and they're terrible, right? We're sad when we hear these stories. But I watch Americans get so full of energy and activism. One child died, so we must do something. And I think, if there's this much energy for the death of one person, what do you do with 300 million? 300 million. And those 300 million, the vast majority of them were slaughtered by governments that grew by promising to give people stuff. That is how they grew. My friend Maylin is here from Cuba. Maylin, would you attest that tyrannical communists do not rise to power by saying, I'm here to be a tyrant, and I'm going to hurt you, and I'm going to put you in secret jails and torture you? They don't say that. They say, we're here to ensure your right to housing and education and health. We're here to give you free stuff. Am I right?
A chicken in every pot and a Volkswagen in every garage.
They give you literally the cue speech on hope and change.
Yes.
And just to put it on the words of my mom, about 8 years ago, when she used to, she was watching a little clip in Univision about former President Obama, one of his speeches. She just looked at me, and my mom is someone that completed only 8th grade. She looked at me and she's like, this guy is just saying the same stuff that Castro was telling to us back in 1959 when I was 17 years old.
Right. So here's the thing. The Constitution that the founders drafted and adopted, from my point of view, I've been studying constitutions my entire adult career. It's pretty good. Not perfect. I would have some changes. I wouldn't have created the post office, by the way. FedEx is much better. But so it's not perfect. It's not pretty good. Remember, the founders could have, you can't blame them for not foreseeing progressivism. They didn't anticipate that. It's a whole transformation of the way the brightest minds view human nature and view society and view God. They didn't anticipate that coming. Also consider, when you think of their Constitution, it was not simply the best possible. It was the best that could be approved, could be voted on by a committee with, 39 people approving it. And then it had to go out and be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. So when you think of, you personally, you might be really talented and really smart. Maybe you individually could sit down and write a constitution better than the founders. You might be able to. The question is, can you get all the states necessary to ratify that? Because you know what happens the minute you show your brilliant constitution to your best friend? Your best friend is going to say, I got an idea for a change or an edit, right? And very quickly, the thing starts to change right in front of your eyes. It's not your brilliant constitution that you developed. So they gave it a heck of a good effort. They produced something that was pretty good. And, the best of them were not overly optimistic. They knew the tendency, and it probably wouldn't surprise them the way things went here. One more, back here. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know about the position of the states? And if so, can you comment?
Yeah, I do know about it. So I know about. I sort of watch it in the news. I've known Mark Levin for many years. I knew Mark 20 years ago in Claremont before he was on radio and all those sorts of things. And he's been sort of spearheading that effort, or at least one wing of that effort. Here's what I have to say about the Convention of States. If it happens, and if they achieve something good, I will be the first to applaud them. Great. I'll even offer suggestions. I tend not to be overly optimistic about these things. You know, when you had the convention in 1787, and remember the commission, the purpose of the convention of 1787 was not to write a constitution. Its purpose was to draft possible amendments for the Articles of Confederation. That was its purpose. And going into that, people like Madison, Hamilton, both of them actually, spent 6 months and they surrounded themselves with historical studies of constitutions. They want to know everything that they could know about the history of constitutions. What were European constitutions like? What were Roman constitutions like? What were Greek constitutions? What kind of constitutional designs have been tried? What were their results, right? So they had this incredible body of thought and learning and reflection going into the convention. I'm not at all convinced that we have a James Madison around today or an Alexander Hamilton. So I'm reluctant. I'm very cautious about a convention of states.
Well, you explain what it is. It's in the Constitution. It's constitutional.
It is constitutional.
Of the state.
Yeah, Article 5 of the Constitution sets forth the process or the processes by which the Constitution can be amended. The way that it has typically happened in American history is Congress proposes a constitution, which requires 2/3 vote in both chambers just to propose an amendment, and then it is submitted to the states, and you need 3/4 of the states to approve it, to ratify it. What this would be, there's another way to propose amendments, and that is a convention of the states. And then it's the same thing, right? So if the convention approves of certain amendments, it would go to the states for their consideration, and then it would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. When you involve that many people, look, I'm going to say something a little harsh here. When you involve that many modern Americans today, I'm not real hopeful that they're going to be supportive for any sort of limited constitution. I grew up in western Kansas, little rural western Kansas. This is the reddest part of the country there is. And stupid me, this was years earlier when I wasn't so wise as I am now. I actually went back there and gave a talk about cutting out farm subsidies. And man, you want to see a bunch of angry Republican farmers, they were ticked off. Don't you take my farm subsidy away. So, I walk away from experiences thinking, what are those people actually going to support in the realm of limited government and individual freedom? I'm not wildly optimistic. Everyone, look, you've hung around for a long time. Thank you very much. I'm gonna take off the microphone. Stick around. Happy to sign copies of the new Citizenship book if you're interested. Also happy to answer any other questions that you might have. Thank you, everyone, very much.